Good morning. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the Center for Innovation's Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. The mission of the center is to catalyze innovation in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry for a better tomorrow for all people. So we thank you for joining us this morning. We'd like to take a moment to express our gratitude to the many sponsors who make our work possible. Thank you so much. Before we get started with today's presentation, I'd like to let you know about some of our current projects. We've just opened registration for a class called the Innovation Lab, taught by Vivek Rao and Rachel Zombach. They have both taught at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Combining design thinking and systems thinking, they help participants manage an innovation challenge. The course can be undertaken by a group or by individuals pursuing a particular question. The class has led to published papers and significant innovations for major companies. You can find out more at the centerforinnovation.org. Register soon, as the first class will begin on June 23rd. The other project that the Center's Board of Directors have been working on is based on a webinar we held last fall, a conversation with leaders of the Lean Institute Ukraine. During that webinar, we asked what we might do to help these courageous men and women charged with rebuilding during war, as well as planning for peace. They told us they wish to come to the United States to see some of our innovative building practices. We took them at their word and began collaborating with the U.S. Commerce Department, the U.S. State Department, USAID, and the Ukrainian Consulate to develop a plan. So the Center for Innovation will host about 10 high-level Ukrainian government officials and leaders from Lean Institute Ukraine in the fall here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We are developing a 10-day study trip to prepare these leaders for peace and reconstruction. The Center for Innovation is also considering a study trip to Kyiv this summer. Estimates of the reconstruction costs are close to $1 trillion. If you are interested in participating or learning more about this effort, please reach out to us via the contact link at the Center for Innovation's website. Now, the event you've been waiting for. Today, you will hear three amazing leaders who recently visited Turkey to view firsthand the devastation following recent earthquakes. They will share what they saw and the implications for California. We invite you to place questions in the chat box, and we will take as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If you would like AIE credits, there is a link in the chat box. Today, we have three speakers. Jennifer Gross, who is an associate principal at Degenkolb Engineers. Jennifer has more than 16 years of structural engineering experience. She has expertise in structural analysis, seismic evaluation, and structural design, and she often reviews the work of younger engineers, which she uses as an opportunity to mentor and train. Welcome, Jen. We also have Adam Hugo-Holman, who's a principal at Degenkolb Engineers. Adam's work focuses on improving the seismic performance of existing buildings and reducing earthquake-related risk to communities and clients living in California and around the world. Welcome, Adam. Finally, Baris Lostuvali joins us. He is a project executive with the Boldt company, practicing integrated project delivery on various complex projects, ranging from pre-construction, new construction, and building renovations for healthcare, commercial office buildings, and industrial facilities. Baris, I think you're going to get us started.
Thanks, Margie. Thanks to Center for Innovation. Good morning, maybe good afternoon, and maybe even good evening for all joining us today on the presentation. So as Margie sharing, we are excited to share what we learned when we took the trip to Turkey a few months back, and it's something that I personally have a lot of feelings and emotions as a native Turk, born raised in Turkey, who have been in States, in California for 20 years. It was all those complex feelings and emotions that took me back to Turkey as I was traveling with my friends, Degenkolb, Adam, Jennifer, and others. So, and again, I think one of the best ways to frame the conversation is really what Henry Degenkolb said, just reading on the screen. The difference between reading a report and seeing it, there's no comparison. No matter how much you read the reports, the impact does not really strike you until you've seen the damage. Again, lots of words of wisdom, wonderful engineering insight, but that's really the difference. That's really what not only the Degenkolb team, there are a number of other teams from the Bay Area, from the US, who travel to Turkey to really see what really happened and how it compares what they would predict from the report. Again, the presentation outline is with a quick introduction, and Adam and Jennifer will cover the ground movement, the typical construction practices in Turkey. We'll share with you the performance of the buildings on different various product types. We will share some of the conclusions and lessons learned, and then we'll shift the conversation more to what it means to California. Obviously, we are, expecting our big one sometime on the horizon, and how do we get ready for that risk? And in response, what can we do as an AEC community to better get ready and prep for the next big one here? Again, the IAA provider statements right here for learning credits and all that. And learning objectives are really, comparing the seismic hazard in Turkey and the Western United States, describing typical construction methods used in Turkey, explain how the buildings perform the Turkey earthquake, and identifying the lessons. And again, the learning objectives really is about unlearning what we know, revisiting our assumptions and relearning based on what we see in this kind of devastating event. So introduction to Turkey, again, that's my homeland. Turkey is in the crossroads. It's in the crossroads of east, west, north, south. It has been crossroads for centuries. It has many, many different facets, the seaside, the archaeological site, the historical sites, so a great place to see. And when you go to Turkey, you're gonna see many, many old structures have been still standing intact, doing fine for centuries, for millennia range. So the question is, again, if they could stand this well after this long, why are we experiencing the devastation in the southeast of Turkey? So with that, here's a quick summary. The Turkey earthquake is really actually two pretty big earthquakes, I'm gonna say. The 7.8 and then 7.5. And these two earthquakes came about 9 hours apart, which really added on and really compounded each other. After the earthquake, close to 18 million people in Turkey and Syria have been impacted. The official dead numbers are about 55,000 and over 130,000 injured. Millions and millions have been displaced from their homes. Nearly, probably more than 50,000 buildings now in ruins or too damaged to enter. And if you look at the financial impacts, the UN is seeing about $100 billion, over $100 billion cost impact after the destruction. So this is in the lives and the economy being severely impacted after the earthquake. Again, I was fortunate enough to have a place in Team 2. Degenkolb had a Team 1 right before the end of the first month, I believe. So when we arrived Turkey in Team 2 with Jen, Adam, and rest of the group, it was about a month later, and that's exactly, what the team is going to tell you more, the things we've seen in that trip. So with that, Jen, you want to take it over?
Sure, thanks, Baris. So this picture up here is just the tectonic map of the Turkey region, really just to highlight the North Anatolian Fault that runs on the east-west, and then the East Anatolian Fault on the east side that almost has a north-south run to it. The two earthquakes that happened in February both occurred off the East Anatolian Fault. So what we wanted to look at was seismic risk, looking at Turkey and California. So the map on the right is from a FOD, which is similar to Turkish FEMA. And you can see with the kind of darker browns and reds, those are the areas of really high seismic risk, which in Turkey correspond to large population centers. Similarly, if you look at the map on the right for the California, the kind of red, pink, white line along the coast is also areas of high seismic risk and also areas of large population centers. What I like about this chart is kind of turning California on its side and looking at it compared to Turkey, you can really see a lot of similarities. So similar to the North Anatolian Fault in Turkey, kind of that San Andreas Fault has that same run, has the same strike slip and very similar slip rate movements. And what's interesting is Istanbul and Los Angeles almost kind of seem to align in this graphic. Again, two very large cities that are due for large earthquake events. The East Anatolian fault that this earthquake occurred on is kind of similar to the Hayward fault in the Bay Area. So what I really like about this chart is it's a response spectra, which that in the x-axis is a period. So it's kind of the natural shaking or movement of a building. And the y-axis is acceleration. So really kind of impact to building, movement of building, intensity of movement. And so what I wanted to point out here is the black solid line and the black dashed line are from the earthquake events in Turkey. And then what we also are doing is comparing it to well-known earthquakes in the US, like Loma Prieta and Northridge in the yellow and blue lines, which some of you on the call may have even experienced. What we really want to point out here is if you notice that black solid line has a higher y-axis value than any of the US earthquakes. So if you've been through one of those earthquakes and felt that shaking intensity, imagine what it was like in Turkey. This is a response spectrograph, so similar period on the X, acceleration on the Y. And really what we wanted to show here that we thought was really interesting is on the map, the light blue star is the epicenter of the earthquake. And a lot of the time we think about the most intense motion happening near the epicenter. But actually, if you look at the chart, there's a dark blue line that's the highest Y values. And in that case, that's the city of Antakya, which is far down in the kind of bottom left corner of the map, which is about a 3-hour car ride from the epicenter. Conversely, the green star for the city of Gaziantep is where we stayed during our trip. Then it had very minimal damage. Life was pretty much back to normal there. And really what this shows is that epicenter doesn't always mean the strongest ground motion. There's a lot of impact of soil conditions. So what we want to talk about is the fault rupture that happened. And this was a very long fault rupture for this earthquake. It was about 200 miles long. So essentially the distance from San Francisco to San Luis Obispo, just trying to give context to the magnitude of this fault rupture. So not just buildings were impacted, the ground did actually move during this earthquake. And so that was evident in many places we visited. This picture is of a surface rupture in Degenkolb. And what I think is interesting is if you look at the picture of the road, you notice that the dashed kind of center divide lines don't meet up anymore. And they're offset by 6 or 7 feet from the movement of the earth. And similarly, this movement occurred just adjacent to the field as well. And you can see that in the picture on the right. So this is another example of that same movement of the earth in Hassa. And on the picture on the left, you kind of see that pile of rubble is almost kind of follows that the rupture, the movement of the ground, just taking away everything in its path. And for the picture on the right, what's unique is this pink building is a school, and kind of this rupture of the earth happened right between the main building and the mechanical building you kind of see pulled away. And where Adams Walking used to be an area of flat pavers. And we saw movements horizontally of about 8.5 feet, but also 42 inches vertically, just to imagine the force and energy it took to move the earth that much. So this is a unique area. It's not sure if this was really surface rupture or a landslide from the earthquake, but it's in the town of Tepehan. And what's unique is this picture that you're seeing is the after effect of the earthquake, but actually before it, this olive grove was all flat at the same elevation. And according to CNN, this kind of crevasse that occurred is 130 feet deep, 900 feet long, and 160 feet wide. When we were there in person, it was so huge, it was really hard for us to take a photo that did it justice. So one of the other unique ground conditions that we saw in the town of Golbashara was liquefaction. And so liquefaction is really when there's a high water table and loosely packed sediments. What happens is if there's a really strong ground shaking, it can actually cause the soil to lose its strength. And so in this town, for instance, there's a lake nearby, so we believe there's really high water tables. So what happened is when the soil doesn't have any bearing strength anymore, it kind of gives out. And so what happened for this building is that it rotated 45 degrees and was really just stopped by the building behind it. And the picture on the left, you can see what you're seeing is just what was buried under the earth before, the foundation, the bottom of the building. And the unique thing is that if you look at the windows, if you look at the building, it actually looks very well intact, just completely rotated. And now I'll pass it back to Adam to talk further about our trip.
Thanks, Jen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the building construction in Turkey, and then also about some of the damage. And the best place to start is with the picture you see in front of you, which is a very ubiquitous and very common construction type in not only Istanbul, but greater Turkey, and especially southern Turkey. This is a residential building. They're typically 5 to 12 stories tall. They are concrete frame buildings where you have concrete columns, concrete beams and concrete slabs. And then they are infilled with brick infill or masonry infill. They don't use metal studs or wood studs like we do typically here in the States. So these create very, very heavy buildings. The other thing to note about it is the open storefront below. This is also very common. They usually have a restaurant or retail downstairs, and similar to San Francisco, you want that space to be well lit with lots of light. So there's often lots of glass, and that heavy amount of walls and construction sort of disappears and it's just columns. And so you create an irregularity or a soft story in this ground floor, and makes it very susceptible to earthquake damage. Here's just a picture of the three varieties of infills. Again, they don't use metal studs or wood studs. We were asking with another engineer, go to their version of Home Depot and you won't be able to find a typical wood stud. You find blocks like this. There's three varieties. There's a clay infill, which is a very light, brittle, sort of what you see up on like a tile roof. There's aerated block, which is basically very light concrete. And then the last one is the CMU block, concrete masonry block. And they will use these often interchangeably, but the takeaway is that they make these buildings very, very heavy and very, very stiff. Now let's talk about codes. There's a lot of similarities between California and our seismic codes and the Turkish seismic codes. There's a lot going on this slide, I apologize, but let's focus in on the horizontal line that runs across the middle of the page. So in the 1930s, Turkey, following a large earthquake, implemented their first seismic code. Similar to the United States, similar to California, where we implemented our first seismic code in the early part of the 20th century. And there were multiple updates through the first half of the 20th century, all the way up until 1975, at which point they implemented or introduced seismic detailing, basically the way that we would tie bars in their concrete buildings. It was introduced, it wasn't enforced. So the implementation of it was mixed. And there were no real updates of that code until approximately the year 2000, at which point they switched to more US-based codes. They used ASC 7, which is what we use here in the States, and have now been implementing code updates on a 10-year basis. So they had one in 2000, 2010, more or less, and just recently. The thing to think about with this, why it's important, is the blocks on the bottom side of that chart show rough percentages of buildings that are in place now. And approximately 60 to 80% of all buildings were built prior to 2000. So the chance of having buildings that have zero seismic detailing or minimal seismic detailing is very high. I saw another chart yesterday that talked specifically about residential buildings where it was more like 50% of the buildings. The last thing I think is important in this, this is something that was new to me when I was in Turkey, is the use of plain or smooth bars. We don't see them very often here. In the United States, we use deformed bars. They have the little dimples on them to help really grab the concrete. And there, the smooth bars were in wide circulation up until the 90s, and then phased out through the 90s, and now they aren't really used. So you have any building that was built before 2000, you have the potential risk of not having detailing and potentially smooth bars, which that combination can be very deadly. So general numbers: Turkey sent out a large number of engineers, experts, professors to go evaluate buildings and tag them shortly after the earthquake. This is the latest numbers we have for all buildings. What I've highlighted on the chart on the right, on the red box, this says about 15% or so buildings were severely damaged or worse. I think collectively within our team and with others that we have talked with, we think this number is probably quite low. In reality, just based on our brief walk there in southern Turkey, we think the number is probably more in the 25 to 30%. And I think you kind of need to let that set in for a second and think about that's 1 in 4, 1 in 3 buildings in a very large swath of area that you will lose that many buildings, 1 in 3. And really the evidence of walking around really bears it out. It was absolutely devastating to so many communities across southern Turkey. And one of the reasons why, and then I'll slide over to the chart on the left. Again, this is that response spectrum that Jen was previously talking about. And there's a period range that those buildings, those 5 to 12-story buildings, fall into, which is the 2 vertical bars I have shown in red and purple. The red line is basically what we would have assumed they would have been designed for, or probably the worst they ever would have been designed for in a force level. And the earthquake for that specific period range of buildings was 2 to 3 times higher than that. So you take a very fragile building and then you hit it with an earthquake that is 3 times larger than it would have ever been designed for. And you have the devastating results that you have here. And I think we have to think about that for ourselves here in California, about there is natural variability in the earthquakes that happen. We do our best to understand them, and there's a lot of very smart people studying our earthquake hazards, but there is variability, and we can't completely predict that the size of an earthquake, and we need to be prepared that an earthquake could be larger than we have designed.
Adam, can I jump in just
Go ahead.
quickly? Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I remember, the earthquake was about 90 seconds long.
Sure. Yeah, I think
Right? I mean,
right.
I think that's important for our audience to kind of visualize. There is this intense shake, but it's that long. Let's call it, I've been through, when I was little in Turkey, we used to get those, earthquakes every year kind of a thing, but I kind of remember them 20 seconds, 40 seconds, but 90 seconds is a pretty intense shake. So just want the audience to, capture and visualize that moment.
And the fact that there were 2 earthquakes, really, they were 9
That's
hours
right.
apart, which is just staggering. I mean, a building, it's a 1-2 punch.
Yep.
So now talking about the performance, and I'll kind of go by building type. So residential buildings by far performed the worst. Again, as I mentioned about just the unique aspect of the force demand and the detailing, that's why we think these buildings perform so devastatingly. So one, the reason why these did so poorly is the earthquake demand was so much higher than the design, the potential for irregularities with the ground floor storefronts or restaurants, the lack of and the potential lack of detailing given the age of construction. And there were instances, as has been reported in a lot of news media, there were instances of poor construction. It led to just a real devastation. I mean, this earthquake happened at 4 a.m. So you got to imagine people were sleeping in their beds or getting up, having a cup of coffee, getting ready for the day, and the world crumbled around them. And it happened in 90 seconds, this level of devastation. It is something that I don't think, and I'll speak for the people that were there, you cannot comprehend. It is just unimaginable. One of the bright spots, I think, was the performance of school buildings. A couple things to highlight about schools in Turkey, and especially in southern Turkey. I was not familiar with this practicing here in the States. It is typically a template design, given that the code has a couple of designs that people can just use sort of off the shelf. And from what we were seeing as we walked around all these cities is that it was pretty well implemented. A lot of these buildings were the same building, kind of copy and pasted, and they performed actually fairly well. So you ask yourself why. Well, one is, there's school buildings, so there's lots of classrooms, so there's lots of walls, lots of transverse walls, typically a corridor down the middle, which had lots of walls. So there was a lot of strength and stiffness in the buildings. They didn't have any irregularities. They didn't have the ground floor storefronts. They were just very typical buildings. We sort of joked it's how an engineer would design a building, not an architect. It was just a very boring building. They also usually had better construction quality. Just having the visibility of it being a school in the center of a community, there were more eyes on it, and likely was constructed in a much better way. And lastly is back to that response spectrum. They didn't see the level of forces based on their height that the residential towers have. One last thing I want to highlight, and this was sort of a bright spot. The green building in the top kind of left was a building that had just been retrofitted, and it was in the town of Baris, and the town had been completely devastated. And we saw this building, and it sort of stood out to us, and we said, what's going on here? And the building had just been retrofitted, and the principal and the school officials were so excited to show us the building, as they should be, because it was great to see that seismic design can work. And when you implement retrofits and you fix these older buildings, they can perform really, really well. It was really great to see. Government buildings, also similar to school buildings, generally perform fairly well. Again, you ask yourself why. They didn't have the irregularities typically. They were just very typical buildings all the way down to the ground, no storefronts. They were also very oftentimes newer buildings. They looked that their construction was probably 5 or 10 years old, so we're incorporating the new seismic designs. They were obviously engineered by structural engineers. Again, more scrutiny so that the construction quality was often appeared to be significantly better. The only building that we saw that was abandoned was at the top left in Malatya, but that was more because there's a big architectural feature that had some slight damage. The building itself looked to be in very good shape. The other one I want to talk about is infrastructure. This is a slide actually that I got a lot of this information from the EERI team, which is a research institute based in the East Bay. They sent several teams. They surveyed a lot of the infrastructure, bridges, dams, electrical power lines. And the general synopsis was that overall they performed fairly well. I think only one dam had to be drained or lowered the water level. Some of them experienced damage, but nothing severe. A lot of the power lines were still standing. The only time they ever fell was when there was a surface rupture underneath them, or like a building fell into the lines. When we were there, cell service was good. Roads were sort of back up and running. We didn't have any issues. There were some landslides that kind of inhibited some traffic, but generally the infrastructure seemed to perform fairly well. Okay, now I'm going to hand it back over to Jen.
So one of the building types that we really wanted to dig into when we were in Turkey was for hospital buildings. And between the two Degenkolb teams, and then there was an EERI focused hospital building team that one of our colleagues was on, we visited 31 hospital buildings. And so what you can see on the map is the color coding of kind of what our observations of damage were for these buildings. And so hospitals are very similar construction to other types of buildings. They're mostly the concrete frame or shear wall with the masonry infill. Modern Turkish code does use higher importance factor for hospitals, just like we do in the United States. And one thing that we thought was really interesting is that base isolation got mandated about 10 years ago for new hospitals with more than 100 beds. And as you can see with the chart on the bottom right, looking at the damage, the base isolated buildings, as we would expect, did very well. But also important to note is looking at just the majority of the buildings that we observed, regardless of base isolated or not, really fell into that no damage to moderate damage range, which again shows that higher importance factor and the kind of importance of the structure really helped with the well-performing hospital buildings. And now we just wanted to go through the next couple of slides. There's just some case studies of some of the hospitals we visited. So this hospital in Malatya is the University Teaching Hospital. It's 6 stories with 2 basements, and it is base isolated. It had little to no structural damage, but there was some non-structural. And even though this building is base isolated and did very well, there was still no water for 2 days, and a sprinkler line broke on the 8th floor, causing some damage, but there was no power disruption. So this one still had a few days of downtime. And so I wanted to point out in the pictures the non-structural issues that we saw. The photo with Adam's head kind of peeking out is some damaged cladding from the children and women's wing. The photo in the center, the upper portion with the arrow kind of pointing at the ceiling. What we were noticing there is that while typically there's a seismic joint you can see on the walls that would be separating the 2 seismically separate structures, it didn't run through the ceiling itself, which we would typically do in the United States, but it actually performed very well. In the photo on the bottom, we're in the basement where you can see on the top of that column is actually the base isolators. And while the building did very well, the large cracking you're seeing in that kind of storage room infill wall is a non-structural wall, but when it was designed, it wasn't designed to take into account that the building would kind of be moving and pounding into it around it. And the picture on the upper right is of a fire sprinkler line that's crossing what we call the moat. So that kind of open area looking of the ceiling is where that base isolation is, giving it movement. And what happened is while the fire sprinkler line itself was given the ability to kind of slide and move as it wanted with the building, by putting the hangers on each side, kind of accidentally kind of restrained it at each end. And what happened was when that fire sprinkler wanted to move, it kind of ripped the hangers off the attachment. So another hospital that we visited was in Erzin, and this was a 4-story hospital with 1 basement. We saw some structural damage, but and more so a decent amount of non-structural damage. And so while there was some pipes that broke, the other main items we looked at, we can see the picture on the upper left is kind of the clay tile sliding off the high roof and falling onto the low roof. And then the picture right below it, you can see that the gable wall collapsed, the masonry wall, and the roof itself, it didn't really have a great lateral system. And also all the equipment attached to it wasn't braced. Some unique highlights, I would say, was in the picture in the center bottom is of the elevator motors, and they weren't anchored, and we would have expected to see a lot of movement and sliding, but we didn't. And then the photo on the upper right is ceiling damage, which was typical. But what I want to say with this is if you look overall, most of the damage really is non-structural or damage that you think, oh, this is repairable. But the building itself was inoperable, it was abandoned. And from talking with the security and maintenance team that was there, it's likely that the building is going to just kind of have a new hospital built next to it that's a 50-bed hospital. So they're not really trying to necessarily salvage this building. So this hospital is in Marash, and it's 7 stories with a fixed base. It had moderate structural damage, but significant non-structural damage to the facade and the masonry walls. So it's evacuated, and we were there a month later, inoperable. And really what this picture is showing is kind of a zoom in, especially at that lower level of the damage to the facade and infill structures, infill walls, as well as you can see all these air conditioning units that kind of fell off the wall onto the ground. So this hospital in Turkey was 4 stories and fixed base. And what was really unique is when we got there, we could tell the building had been abandoned and no one was there, but we really didn't see any structural damage. But really the story was more when we were able to get inside the building and see the severe non-structural damage. So what these photos conveyed, like, we were really shocked by what we saw with these photos, and everything that had been attached to overhead was on the ground. All the heavy masonry walls were kind of, infill walls were switched on the floor. Some of the stairs were even impassable. And really what this means is that things like where you can see the photo with the arrow, there's a sheet hanging out the window. We heard that occupants had to rappel out the window to get out due to blocked egress paths. So this hospital was inoperable because of its non-structural performance. So really both of these pictures again are in non-structural component issues within hospitals. So ranging from equipment anchorage issues to suspended ceilings and infill wall having damage. And so what we want to drive home is, like, because of non-structural component damage failures, these buildings are likely to be demolished, even though the structure itself performed fairly well. So now I kind of wanted to come wrap it up with some of our conclusions and findings from our observations. So one of the things we wanted to touch on was soil conditions. So while there's bad buildings that will suffer damage, these high concentrations of damage that you can see in these maps really point to larger issues with soil conditions and pockets of poor soil. So again, soil conditions make a big impact on building performance. As Adam talked about before, irregularities can make a big issue on building performance. That soft story, that open storefront on the bottom can really cause the building to twist and torque about itself, causing the damage you see in the photo on the right. Again, driving home the importance of having good detailing and design. We saw evidence of poor detailing and design, whether that's how long the rebar was, how well the rebar was confined, how well it was detailed. And I think the important thing to think about is, you know, in the US, we've changed our code from the 70s as well in terms of detailing and how we do confinement of concrete. So older buildings don't have the same level of detailing that a code level building built in the 70s would have now. And so newer buildings are detailed better, both in Turkey and in the US. So we just wanted to show some photos where we're noting issues with quality of construction. In these photos, what you're seeing is really the concrete and the rebar should kind of act as one and really be adhered to each other. And in these photos, you see the rebar almost just rips right off of the concrete. This photos, while these elements are intact, the fact that you can see the rebar kind of peeking through shows it doesn't really have a lot of clear cover, which means that it's really susceptible to elements, water, and damage, which means the rebar's capacity and strength is not what was designed for. Even this is a base isolated hospital building that we saw under construction. You can see that the rebar already has rust and damage to it before the building's even been finished being built. And then quality of construction, this is just, we saw a plastic bottle basically poured into the concrete column while the building was being built. And then the photo on the right is actually, Adam took a piece of concrete and kind of crumbled it in his hand and kind of has just the couple pieces of the aggregate rock left. So just not the quality of concrete we would have designed for. So again, kind of the importance of thinking about and being concerned about non-structural damage. Non-structural damage is the reason some buildings are likely to be demolished. And while in the US for hospitals, especially in California, we're very careful about bracing and anchoring equipment and non-structural components. That's not necessarily happening for other building types, maybe in office space. And also even for buildings where non-structural stuff is being anchored, what's the level of inspection of that versus the structural components? So now I'll pass it back to Adam.
Thanks, Jen. So I think it's important to sort of ground this back into the West Coast and understand, what does this actually mean for us? Like, what we often think about earthquakes happening in different parts of the world, and maybe we sort of push it off and think, that's another part of the world, and that doesn't really apply to us. And I think it's important that we take a second to reflect on what the risk is here in the Bay Area and especially in Southern California. The USGS has done several studies on the potential for and likelihood for earthquakes to happen here in the Bay Area. And as you can imagine, the risk is very, very high. and for not very small earthquakes. These are very large earthquakes, and the potential for them are very large. And I think we need to recognize that risk and realize that an earthquake could happen tomorrow. And are we ready for that? The other thing I think is important, and this is a tie to what happened in Turkey, is this idea of the 1-2 punch, that where there's two earthquakes that happen in rapid succession. In Turkey, they were 9 hours apart. In the Bay Area and in Southern California, it isn't really one single fault that goes through our area. It's a multitude of faults that go through. In the Bay Area, we have the San Andreas, and then we have the Hayward fault, and those interact with each other. And as one would release stress, it could redistribute that stress to another fault, and you have the potential to have something as devastating as you'd had in Turkey. And that is, I think it's really important to think about, because that risk is real, and the potential for a 1-2 punch is similar to what happened in Turkey. And I think we need to acknowledge that. The other thing I think we often try to dismiss is that maybe the construction type and the poor inspection or construction quality that happens in Turkey is not really something we have to worry about. We have a much stronger construction industry, and we do, but there are still old buildings that pose a risk in our society. The Chronicle published an article shortly after this earthquake discussing that in San Francisco alone, there are 4,000 non-ductile concrete buildings. And those are very similar buildings to what we saw in Turkey, these concrete heavy buildings. And they pose a real risk in our society. And I know that Southern California, LA has passed, and several cities within the Southern California area have passed legislation to require those buildings to be evaluated and potentially retrofitted. And San Francisco is working on that, but I hope that gets implemented soon. So certainly in Southern California as well, they've done studies. The LA Times wrote an article recently about how if a large earthquake happens, there's the potential for a significant amount of those non-ductile concrete buildings to collapse and lives to be lost. So the building type, while we do have different types of construction than they do in Turkey, we do have some similar buildings that do pose a real risk to our communities. There was also some federal reports that were produced where they did sort of scenario events where they would look at what would happen if there was a large earthquake that happened. For these two here that I'm highlighting that were happening on the San Andreas in the Bay Area, or happening on the Hayward fault Hayward fault runs right through the East Bay. It actually runs right down the middle of, I think it's the Memorial football field at Cal. And the numbers are devastating. I mean, the numbers are huge and significant. It's something that reminds us that there's a real risk here. On the San Andreas, you're talking $60 billion worth of loss, deaths of 2,500 people, and lots of buildings heavily damaged. And similarly on the Hayward fault, both faults pose a real risk to our communities. Turkey and in the United States, and California specifically, have a shared history of earthquake damage. We learn from each other. A lot of great structural engineers live and work in Turkey and also come to the United States, and we go there and we share a lot of the similar design philosophies and work together. And because we have this shared risk, we've experienced earthquakes for a very long time, and we continue to try to figure out ways to design for them. We're tied at the hip in the sense that we need to work together and learn from their earthquakes in the same way that they learn from ours. The last portion of this presentation is more about what the broader community can do. What do we think about, and what do we take home from the lessons of this earthquake and incorporate into our practice? And I think the first one is working together. I think too often in our construction industry, we often see each other as adversaries, and we try to sort of defend against what others are telling us to do. And I think that's not really the spirit. I think we need to continue to work collaboratively together and innovate in how we can improve our construction practice and industry to make our buildings safe. And that's working on codes, that's working with having high quality contractors, working with our engineers, and working together to make sure not only that we have high seismic performing buildings, but also doing it cost effectively, being able to innovate our way into making better buildings for our communities. The other big takeaway was caring for all buildings. I think during the pandemic, we sort of reevaluated what the word essential workers were. And I think we need to think about what that means for our buildings as well. I think we need to reevaluate what an essential building is. We've spent a lot of time and money, and it's been well spent on protecting our schools and hospitals. And in this earthquake in Turkey, we saw those buildings often perform very well, but they were often surrounded by a community that was completely devastated. And so they had nobody to serve. What good is a school if there's no kids that can go to that school? And I think we need to think about that here. Do we design our buildings that are our homes or our offices or our grocery stores and think about what their seismic performance is and what it means if they were offline for a very long time after a big earthquake? This one was very shocking for us when we were there. Designing for repairability, the idea that after an earthquake, a lot of these buildings in Turkey especially will be demoed. They were very hard to repair. There was this building on the right was in construction. It wasn't even never had an occupant in the building, and they were going to have to demo the building because the damage to the building was significant enough that it was more cost effective to demo. And I think we need to think about how our buildings will perform after the earthquake. What level of damage are we able to repair and keep the building operational or running following the earthquake? Which actually ties to my next point here, which is understanding the risk. I think there's a big disconnect between the structural engineering community and the broader community, which is we design buildings. The code requires buildings to be life safe, and we design for life safety. And what that means is that you can get out of the building safely after an earthquake. My perception is the broader community thinks that their buildings will be back up and running shortly after the earthquake. There's thoughts of, well, we made it through Loma Prieta, we did okay, and my building was designed to code. And not taking into effect that, one, the design parameters that we use will potentially have your building out of stock, not working after the earthquake happens. And if your building was built, and that's built to a current code, if the building was built in the 1970s, you have a much higher risk. And so I think we as a community need to better understand what risk we have in our building stock. When that, it's working with an engineer or working with others to figure out, okay, when was my building built? What codes was it designed to? What's the expected performance of it? Well, there's a lot of innovative tools that we have in our community to understand that risk and evaluate that risk, because you can't really tackle a problem that you don't fully understand. And my last slide is about community resilience. Like I said before, there were so many instances where entire neighborhoods, entire cities and villages were completely devastated. And they had to, in many cases, they were talking about having to pick up and just completely move the city. And I think it's just so devastating that when that happens to an entire city. And I think we need to think about what that means for here in the Bay Area and especially in San Francisco, where there's a lot of older buildings, and the risk that we have in our communities to really being shut down for some time after the earthquake. And I think I want to take this opportunity to kind of give a shout out to UCSF and the work that they've done in taking seismic hazard real and pushing us, the structural engineers, to think differently about how we design buildings and looking at multiple different hazards and thinking of and just pushing us forward to think differently about how we design buildings and making sure that they're designed well and collaboratively with the full design team. And with that, I think that's all our slides. I want to thank you all for giving us the opportunity to share what our findings and what we saw in southern Turkey in this incredibly devastating earthquake. And if there's any questions, Margie, maybe you can help us weed through those to figure out so we can answer them. Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Baris. This is in some ways a very difficult presentation to look at this much devastation, but I think you've outlined for us lessons we can learn, and sometimes facing that devastation is the most important thing that we could do. I guess I would have a question, and I'd like each of you to respond to it, is if the governor was on this call, Governor Newsom, what would you tell him he should be thinking about for California and putting in place so that we don't see this level of devastation in the state?
It's a good question. I guess maybe I'm off mute. So I would say, one is I think we need to do a better job of pushing forward the retrofit ordinances. I know a lot of cities are really starting to take those seriously, and I think we need to do a better job of getting those in place, because right now we do know how to fix them. It's more about a cost and the level of effort and displacement and swing space of people moving out of those buildings to get those retrofits implemented. So I think we need to keep pushing forward on those ordinances.
So building on Adam's point and remembering that three-leg stool and the way he was putting safe buildings, also high-performing buildings, we really need to revisit that and really rethink and revisualize that concept of high performing. Again, there are a number of factors about structural performance. There's also, sustainability, resilience. There's so many factors on how we are designing and approaching design, engineering, and construction practices. And it's a complex issue. It's a complex puzzle. So the more we interact and be creative, and again, Center for Innovation, that's what it promotes, that relearning and unlearning is so important for better high performing buildings. So I would love to see more of that.
I think for me, the big thing, which we kind of touched on right at the end, was the idea of community resiliency. And also just, I think we didn't mention this in the presentation, but we were there about a month after the earthquake, and most of the people were still living in tents. They're not back in a permanent residence. They're not going to school. I mean, their day-to-day life is not the same, and it's been a month. And I think here in the Bay Area in California, we think it's going to be faster than that. And if we don't think about community resilience besides just our building, but like, how does the food get to us? How do we have water? How do we have power? Then we're really setting ourselves up for a really long-term rebuild, which only increases the economic impact and only really, people are going to want to leave and move somewhere else if it's a month later and they're still living in a tent. They're not going to want to stay here. So we have to figure out how we can, as a community, bounce back quickly after an earthquake.
I think that's such a great point that you raise, which is it's about the people. Of course, this presentation has, by its very nature, focused on the buildings, but I wonder if you could talk about the impact on people and how that is integrated in thinking about rebuilding, and maybe people in Turkey aren't even really ready to start approaching thinking about it at this point in time.
Again, we're looking at millions and millions of people who got displaced. That is a massive number. And there's no clear plan. They have lost their homes, they lost their schools, they lost their, again, Jen's point, their communities. They have to go somewhere else to start a new life. And I really don't know. And I haven't seen any major, government public systems are really trying to figure that out. And as we're talking about these millions of people getting displaced, the next big earthquake is going to be in Istanbul. Istanbul is a global 15 million people, high density urban city. And the projection is that it could be within 10 years, 15 years, something at this scale could happen. I think it's very concerning. I honestly don't know the plan, and I just hope that there will be a plan soon.
Margie, can I say one thing? And I didn't articulate it as well in this presentation, but I think it's important. As we were walking around southern Turkey, we're structural engineers, and so we were often really getting into the weeds on the detailing and the buildings, and you would lose track that these were people's homes and their towns. And then every once in a while something would pull you back, because a lot of these towns were completely abandoned. There was nobody there. One that sticks out to me is we were in the town of Atakia that was just devastated by this earthquake. And there was a gentleman that was walking, and we were talking with him, and he said, well, I'm here because there was 5 buildings and they were nothing but rubble. He said, I lost my sister and her entire family in that building. And it gives me goosebumps now to think about it. You need to remember the devastation on individual lives, and the importance of why seismic design is so necessary for our communities, because we talk about big numbers of billions of dollars, but it's individual lives that are actually affected. And it's just heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking.
Adam, I think that's the heart of it, really. We do forget about that. We talk in the Center for Innovation a lot about the innovations we can use to build better. But really, why are we doing this? We're doing it for people, our clients, our friends, our neighbors, ourselves, and our own families. And really, that's what it all comes down to.
Yeah.
I'm curious about you touched a little bit, each of you, on the ideas of resilience within community, and so I wonder if you could just talk about what you might have observed within the realm of thinking about resilience within communities, either the buildings and the people.
Again, when we were there a month later after the earthquake, again, it was super impressive. It was heroic how people were interacting with us. They were taking us literally. Adam showed that school when we were in Hassa. We were walking, and this person comes along and say, "Hey, there's something I want to show you. I want to talk to you," and everything. It was amazing how much they were willing to share and tell us their experience, and how they want to bounce back and how they're bouncing back. And again, it was wonderful to see that. It was wonderful to see that in the hospitals, in the schools. But it will take some time. It will take a lot of effort and time, and to get back to life.
And for those of you who may not know, there's an election coming up within a week or two in Turkey, which could have some very real implications, I think, for the way that reconstruction is considered. And we're not a political institution, but should you be able to vote in the Turkish election, we would strongly urge you to do so. Let me just ask our panelists whether they have any last comments. I think you've moved us quite deeply with the work that you've done, the observations you've made, and also helped ground it for those of us in California who may think, Turkey's a long way away. Well, the devastation that we've seen there has implications for us here too. So any last comments from the panelists?
Dr. Milad was asking, did you find that there's an absence in the official engineering observation, in parentheses, Control Bureau of Engineering, to prevent such failure? I say yes. I mean, exactly. There is, again, the way I'm reading the questions, really the role of quality control, quality assurance practices and inspections is such an important part of what we do, how we do construction in the States. And I think there are many failures of that in the world of construction in Turkey. So I think that will be a big step moving to the next generation of doing and building better buildings in Turkey. Adam, you've seen that quite a bit too, right?
Yeah. One thing I think is important to think about when a building collapses, it's usually or rarely just one thing that really makes that building fall down. There's multiple steps that need to kind of break down. So I know there's a lot of discussion about the construction quality, but that is a part of what made some of these buildings so susceptible. And all those steps put together ends up with the level of devastation that you saw in southern Turkey.
Thanks. We also have a question here from Dean Pardee. He asks, as a cold form steel fabricator, I'm perplexed by the underutilization of cold form steel. New growth wood and heavy concrete seems to be the default. I've learned that most SE schools do not spend much time on CFS framing education. Thoughts?
That's true. I would agree with the comment. I think the wide practice of it in usage of it in Turkey is more maybe a factor of a bunch of things, cultural, the people there are used to building a certain way. I think they often look at us and a little bit silly thinking that we build our houses out of wood. We get fires in our homes a lot more regularly and have that damage. So there's probably a lot going on there, but I do agree with the comment that the use of CFS as a design philosophy in structural engineering school is less prevalent. We usually focus on concrete and steel as an initial pass.
Just Adam, building on that point, and base isolation is a relatively new solution for Turkey, right? And again, but we're seeing more and more hospitals and building adapting base isolation for a way to deal with this earthquake motion. So similar to the cold form framing, again, I could see that when the right applications is in place. Yeah. It's a matter of introducing, and it's a matter of really, again, innovation and looking things differently.
Okay, I hate to do this because this has been such a rich conversation, but we've come to the end of our time together. Our deepest thanks to Adam, Jen, and Baris for such an insightful presentation. Thank you for taking this journey, and thank you for sharing your insights. We've recorded this session and we'll place it in on our website, thecenterforinnovation.org, in the coming days. Our webinars are now available as podcasts, so check it out wherever you download your podcast. If you have questions about our innovation lab or the center's work in the Ukraine, please reach out to us using the Contact Us link on our website. And special thanks to our amazing behind the scenes, making the magic all happen team of April Willoughby and Katie Olson. Finally, if you're not yet a member of the Center for Innovation community, it's free. Please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to receive updates on the many innovative webinars and events we host each year. Thank you again to all of our sponsors who make all this possible, to you, our community of innovators, and for all that you do to transform our industry. Thank you all, and see you soon.